We are here with Dr. Danilychev, who is originally from Moscow, Russia. She's lived in the US since 1990, and in 1996, she graduated from the University of California, Irvine with a BS in Biological Sciences and obtained her medical degree in 2000 at the Tel Aviv University in Israel. She completed her residency in internal medicine at NYU and was one of the first responders during the 9/11 tragedy. After residency, Dr. Danilychev completed a fellowship in geriatric medicine at UCLA. And since 2004, Dr. Danilychev has been providing symptom management and end-of-life care in San Diego, California. In addition to hospice work, she is also actively involved in clinical research. After doing extensive research into Reiki and its styles and subtypes, Dr. Danilychev chose to learn Jikiden Reiki because it has been passed down directly and unmodified from its founder, Mikao Usui. Dr. Danilychev is my Reiki master. After I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, I was waiting to start chemo and radiation, and I just didn't want to sit around and do nothing, for weeks. And so I went online and I saw a bunch of different Reiki sites, but what stood out with your Reiki site, Dr. Danilychev, is the fact that you're a medical doctor and that you're also a Reiki master. And I think that's pretty unusual, right?
Yes, actually, I think I'm the only doctor in the US that can practice and teach the Japanese style Reiki.
And that's pretty amazing. So first of all, I'm going to go back to that, but I want to ask you first, just because a lot of people ask me the question all the time, well, what is Reiki and how does it work?
Okay. So Reiki, so there are two parts to Reiki. So Reiki, there is a universal life force energy concept, and also Reiki as a technique utilizing the universal life force energy. So I think most people are familiar with the Qi, which is the Chinese word for ki. So Japanese it's ki, in Chinese it's Qi. So life force energy that's basically is everywhere. And Reiki is, again, in Japanese language, it's the language itself is a lot more complicated than most of the Latin-based languages or the English language. But in the Japanese language, the word Reiki has so many different meanings. Ultimately, it's universal life force energy, the mystical power of the universe, the mysterious cosmic force, something like that. So that's Reiki in terms of energy. And as far as Reiki as a technique, it was developed in the 20th century by Mikao Usui in Japan. And he figured out a way how to tap into this life force energy. And he called his technique Shinshin Kaizen Usui Reiki Ryoho, which is basically Usui Reiki method for improvement of body and mind. So it's most definitely a mind-body technique utilizing the universal life force energy. So that's the, I guess, the best way to describe Reiki.
And so how does that work? Like when you're using universal life energy as working on healing someone, how does that work? How do you do that?
So it's actually the founder of Reiki himself, he didn't quite know how that even happened, but he found out that if he put his hands on someone, that person became better and felt better. So he organized his experiences and created a technique utilizing this energy. So basically, a Reiki practitioner, once they put their hands on someone, that creates that energy flow that allows a person to self-improve in a way. It's quite a unique concept. It's not based on anything we understand from science. However, Mikao Usui himself, he believed that at some point this method and how it works will be explained by science. And I'm sure myself that at some point we'll understand it from a scientific perspective. But in terms of the way it works, the practitioner is able to channel the energy. And also the practitioner learns how to sense the energy flow interruptions in the person receiving Reiki. And this way, the energy can be directed to places where it's needed most. And again, it's a very simple technique. Ultimately, there are some challenges here and there in terms of practice and getting to utilize the technique effectively, but overall anyone can learn. It's really quite simple.
Part of what makes people a little, I guess, unsure of how it works or if it's working is because it is such a simple technique. And so it begs the question, like, can anyone do it? And what do I need to do in order to learn it?
So literally anyone can learn Reiki. It's remarkably simple. The technique that I practice, it comes from Japan, so it was preserved in Japan. So it's deeply rooted in Japanese culture. So I would say probably the most challenging part is actually understanding the Japanese culture and how it connects to Reiki. But as far as Reiki itself is such a simple, gentle method. Again, the practitioner places his or her hands on a person and a person feels better. It's really as simple as that. It's remarkable. Like, again, I'm laughing just because as a doctor, it seems that it should not work. And literally every time I have a client that comes in for Reiki, I feel that, okay, this time it's not going to do anything. This time it's not going to work. And then sure enough, I'm surprised and the client is, but we're both surprised. Because medically, I don't see any explanation for some of the miraculous transformations that can take place with Reiki. I've had quite a few very impressive stories with my clients, how they've improved, and you yourself included. Although I can't take all the credit for it, or Reiki, obviously it's not me, it's Reiki, but I think it was probably played some role in how well you're doing, how well you're feeling. It's really just remarkable.
Being a medical doctor, how did you first learn of Reiki?
So as most medical doctors, I've been trained in science basically my whole life, preparing myself for medical career. And again, Reiki and other alternative modalities, most medical doctors will look at them as, okay, if patients really want them, great, but they don't do anything. And that's the best case scenario. And in the worst case scenario, we see the aftermath of patients utilizing alternative methods from charlatans, getting charged a lot of money, and then coming to us really sick. And that's when we try to help them. And again, oftentimes it's too late. So this is the general experience for most doctors with alternative treatments. Over the years, more and more people are utilizing alternative medicine, and so there have been more and more studies, especially on acupuncture, to demonstrate its effectiveness for pain and other conditions. And for me personally, it was my direct exposure to alternative medicine through hospice work. So when I was working at the inpatient hospice unit here in San Diego, at San Diego Hospice, a lot of these modalities were utilized: acupuncture, healing touch, Reiki, aromatherapy. And again, in the beginning, as I was training as a fellow in hospice and palliative medicine, it seemed like it's wonderful that patients have access to these modalities, but I really personally did not believe that there was any value in them until I started seeing some remarkable effects. Initially, it was with acupuncture. It was one of my patients had a dramatic improvement in his condition, and the only explanation I had at the time was acupuncture, because nothing else has changed. And it was just so remarkable that it forced me to pay attention to patients that received alternative modalities. And over time, it really became not a question anymore that, yes, there's definite value in them. And I thought, okay, let me see if I can learn some of it. I want to know what these practitioners are doing to my patients that make them feel so much better. So I started looking into learning acupuncture, Reiki, healing touch, and it just happened to be that Reiki was the quickest and easiest thing to learn. So it was purely, I had the time, a few weeks off, and I thought, okay, why not learn Reiki just out of curiosity? There was no, I didn't have an ambition to pursue it as a career choice or as a practice, literally just to know what's going on with my patient, what's helping my patients.
Well, I have to say that's quite admirable of you, because I know a lot of doctors. I've met a lot of doctors over the past year going through cancer treatment. And I've mentioned that I did, Reiki, and that it was quite helpful. And I could just see their eyes glaze over. And the comments were usually like, well, hey, if that's working for you, then just keep doing it, as opposed to, hey, maybe this might work with some of my clients, and so there's that big wall between Western trained doctors and then people who try the alternative arts and the alternative healing. So, I mean, big kudos to you. I'm especially grateful for you studying that. And so when you're working in hospice care, what kind of improvement did you see in some of your patients?
It was literally everything from pain improvements to some people had severe edema, severe swelling, resolution of swelling. Um, People who had some agitation or restlessness, helping with that. Any symptoms also, it was helpful for the family members who were sometimes just as distressed as their loved ones. So it was quite remarkable. Again, over time, and I can't think of every single condition that it helped. So it's not that it would cure things per se, but it would resolve debilitating symptoms. So that was my focus ultimately. And again, as a hospice palliative medicine, oftentimes we're not able to cure certain conditions, but we can make a person's life as great as possible with the least amount of burden of symptoms and so on. So to me, it was definitely something worth looking into. But to comment on what you mentioned about some of your doctors, the difference is that I've been watching it for 10 years. So 10 years of observing slight improvements, significant improvements related to alternative modalities. And that's what forced me to really take it seriously, not just dismiss it just because there's not enough research. That, again, ultimately for Western medicine doctors, the only obstacle is lack of evidence. So if there's evidence to demonstrate effectiveness, then it wouldn't be a question. Doctors would completely support it.
You mentioned the data. There's more and more data coming out. I just saw an article in the Atlantic that was published recently saying that, why does Reiki work? Because all signs basically point to that it shouldn't work. Mm-hmm. Does it work when you're talking about your clients, does it work on an emotional level and a physical level?
Yes, exactly. It actually works. It's a mind-body healing method, just like the Shinshin Kaizen Sui Reiki Ryoho, just like the name of it implies. So it definitely works on a physical level, but it can also transform any kind of emotional distress a person may have. And again, there's no guarantee that it's going to solve everyone's problems, whether it's physical or emotional, but I would say it just lifts a certain level of burden somehow. Again, I don't have an explanation. And especially the emotional aspects, and because it can be used for treatment of addictions, treatment of, and again, I'm using the word treatment, not in a legal sense, of course, because we can't say that, but it can be used to help people who have addictions, because again, it works in some remarkable way. Again, we don't understand quite how, but it can transform a person's mindset. So that's how it can help someone who's dealing with bad habits or some kind of psychological burden that's holding a person back.
Okay.
So it's truly a mind-body method. And I can say it's also a spiritual method because for many people, many of my clients, they've had spiritual breakthroughs with Reiki. This is something that, especially as a doctor, I'm not necessarily anticipating, but many people gain clarity about certain things, connect to their true selves. So it's really something quite special.
Well, I have to say it brought up a lot of, what would be the best phrase to describe? I mean, it brought up so many emotions for me. It brought up many ideas that were childhood traumas. That I remember the first time I met you, and I was lying on your table, and you had your hands on me, and and doing the healing. I just remember seeing this word neglect come across my forehead internally, like I saw the word. And it was not just neglect that I had felt from my childhood, but it was neglect that I had, that I'd neglected myself. And that was sort of the beginning of this long road that I took with you, of discovering a lot of things about me that I think were rooted in maybe one of the reasons why my cancer came back. Mm-hmm. And you said earlier, that you didn't have a whole lot of time, and that was the easiest thing to learn. But there's a lot of training that goes on in Reiki.
Yes. Yes, and in the beginning, I didn't realize it because the training itself was, I think, 3 to 5 days. Actually, my initial training was only 3 days. So I thought, okay, let's see. Again, as an ambitious doctor, I'm trying to think, okay, how can I get to the next level? And then next level was another just a couple days, which I completed several months later. And then how do I get to the next level? For the next level, I had to practice. So it was 120 clients, 120 hours, 40 different clients. And so I actually opened my practice and started a business purely to get experience so I could get to the next level. So it's, in retrospect, it sounds very silly, but again, coming from a doctor's perspective, that makes sense. If you want to be an expert at something, you just keep going until you get to the next level. But now I see it completely differently. It takes practice, just like with anything, and it doesn't matter which level you achieve. There's no, it's not a competition. It's not a race. It's not about one person being better than somebody else. Just use it, help people, and you'll get better at it. That's the way I would describe it.
And so if it's as easy as putting your hands on somebody and healing, what do you learn in the training that make you a better practitioner?
So basically through the training, you get to really tap into that energy. So anyone has this ability to begin with. But naturally, if you have a headache, you naturally hold your head, or if your stomach hurts, you naturally put your hands on your stomach. So all of this is already natural and built in. We're not really tapped into it normally. But with training, you literally you're able to completely and fully connect to that ability that you already have. So not to mention, of course, learning the essence of Reiki, certain specific techniques. There's some very specific, interesting techniques. Again, I can't get into the details right now, but if you know them, it would make that experience, that ability, so much more effective.
And how you know them or learn them is by studying the healing art and learning more about the culture where it came from.
Yes, I think that's definitely helpful. Again, in Jikiden Reiki, which is a traditional Japanese style Reiki preserved in Japan, and it's very clear that it's so deeply rooted in Japanese culture. And by understanding more of it, it makes a lot more sense. Again, even though some of the aspects of Japanese culture, of course, they're explained, but once you get to know the culture a little bit better, that makes a lot of things about Reiki make so much more sense. Mikao Usui Sensei has developed this technique. His ability came to him completely unexpected, but then once he discovered that he was able to heal people by placing his hands on them, he eventually developed a technique and eventually figured out a way how to share it with other people, pass it on. And that's and literally Jikiden Reiki means directly passed on teaching. So the way Usui Sensei taught Hayashi Sensei, who was one of his students, who taught Chiyoko Yamaguchi, who ultimately, her and her sons, started the Jikiden Reiki Institute. And they're basically preserving the traditional Japanese Reiki technique. I would say a lot of people don't realize that Reiki came from Japan, or that it's a Japanese healing modality. It's not a new age treatment. It's not woo. I would connect Reiki in some ways. It's closer to acupuncture than some of the other modalities that people perceive Reiki to be.
Okay. How long has Reiki been around?
So it's been around since the 1920s. So Mikao Usui founded in the 1920s.
We'll get into the difference between Jikiden and Western, but there are many people who have gone through the class and are able to be teachers in Reiki. But the way that you learned is in direct lineage with the originator of Reiki, correct?
Yes. So I've learned from Tadao Yamaguchi Sensei, who is the son of Chiyoko Yamaguchi, who learned from Hayashi Sensei, who directly learned from Mikao Usui. Yes, that's correct.
So you're very much in keeping with the tradition of Reiki and the way that it should be preserved and handed down.
I feel very passionate about it because it's very easy for something like this, especially something that comes from a foreign country, to get diluted and misinterpreted. A lot of things can get lost in translation. So I feel very passionate about preserving the tradition and making sure that I'm teaching exactly how I was taught and not introducing anything of my own. Of course, I can maybe share a story of my personal experience with Reiki with my students, or share my medical take on things, but ultimately, the way I teach Jikiden Reiki, I'm doing my best to teach it as close to the original as I can, um, um, as I'm able to do it.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that you've seen some of your patients really improve. And are you able to share any of the stories of seeing improvement in some of your patients?
Sure. A lot of improvements, like, again, quite remarkable. And sometimes they're really, in a way, unexpected. And I've had my own personal experiences with Reiki where I had improvements that were quite remarkable. But I can share that, for example, one of my clients, she had post-chemotherapy neuropathy and post-surgical pain after breast cancer treatment. And she was suffering with these conditions for at least 5 years. And when she came to me, she was literally, she was on high doses of painkillers, opiates, and other adjuvant treatments. And she was still in a lot of pain, literally crying in pain from what she was describing. And although it took some time to get improvement, but her improvement was absolutely miraculous because her neuropathy completely resolved, which is, again, medically, it's impossible. Literally, it's impossible. I have no explanation except for, Reiki is amazing. And again, we don't understand how it works, but yeah, it was remarkable. So that's, for example, I would say that's probably one of the most incredible examples to me, because it was an incurable condition that resolved. So not only her pain went away, she regained ability to feel, because she completely lost her ability to feel anything with her hands. So if she would touch anything, she wouldn't be able to tell if it's cold or hot, or texture. Again, it was very debilitating, and it's remarkable that with Reiki it got resolved completely.
Well, and I have my own story of neuropathy, not having neuropathy, because I was receiving Reiki during the entire time during two, pretty intense courses of chemotherapy treatment. And I remember at one point feeling a little bit of tingling on the top of my fingers, where there wasn't a whole lot of feeling in that spot. And with Reiki, I have full feeling in my fingers and toes, so that wasn't even an issue, thankfully.
And I remember you were sharing how much energy you had, how well you felt during your treatment, which was also surprising. If you wouldn't expect someone putting their hands on you to make you feel good during chemotherapy, right?
Taking your class. So I took the first level class with Frank Arjava, Shoden, and then I took Okuden with you, which was that was a really fun class to learn, just the people who were in it, but all the different things, the different techniques that you learned. That was really amazing. But you were so generous to organize your students to come to my house. I think it ended up being like 4 days a week. When I wasn't in Los Angeles getting treatment, they would come to my house in San Diego, and I would receive Reiki for anywhere from 1 to 2 or more hours. And I'm still so grateful for that, and for all the people who came over and gave me Reiki. It completely transformed my life. Instead of feeling really kind of sick and tired and on the sofa on the weekend after getting chemo, Bruce and I were up and around and going to get dinner and seeing a movie, and our lives were pretty normal considering what I was going through. And so having Reiki as part of the treatment was really, it was a life changer, not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually too. When you're going through cancer, you've had patients, I'm sure, that have said the same thing. It kind of knocks you off your balance. You have a hard time kind of holding on to things. And that was, it really helped put me in a better frame of mind in order to continue with the healing process. It was invaluable. It was invaluable. Thank you.
I'm glad.
Thank you again. And so do you have so the patient you just referred to, I'm assuming she had chemotherapy treatments and she was experiencing neuropathy. Do you have any other patients who were going through cancer that you could comment on as far as how the treatment worked for them?
I think for the most part, in terms of nausea from chemotherapy, pain, so those are very common symptoms that can be helped with Reiki. Definitely neuropathy, fatigue, any kind of emotional, spiritual struggle that people may have facing a serious illness. And I have to say, it's not just related to cancer. It could be for anything really, which is also quite remarkable. But cancer specifically, literally, in my experiences, whatever the symptoms a person may have experienced, people usually feel better.
Okay. Does Reiki work on everyone?
I would say, in my experience, again, I can't say that it works on every single person, but so far, I would say maybe since 2013, there was only one person who told me that they didn't feel anything. So I wouldn't say it's 100%, but it's pretty close to that.
Are there any patients who won't benefit from Reiki?
I think anybody could benefit, really, because again, it's so gentle. It's just such an incredibly comforting technique that even just for that alone, just to get to this relaxed, calm, peaceful state of mind, I think even if that's the only effect a person can get from it, I think it's definitely worth a try. And the way I personally look at it, as a practitioner of Reiki, that I don't want to charge people for something that doesn't do anything for them. So if someone tells me, okay, I did absolutely nothing, I'm more than happy to refund the money, because it's just, I know how effective it is. I'm pretty confident it's going to help, but at the same time, if it doesn't help, I don't want to put someone in a position of trying something and being disappointed and not gaining benefit.
How has your practice changed since you learned Reiki and started practicing?
So it's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed is that as a doctor, I'm able to connect more to the art of medicine, the art of healing. I'm able to connect more to my patients directly, kind of sense what they need and what they're experiencing, and also to tap into my empath skills more, something I didn't even realize was me. And I've had a number of experiences where my medical patients who didn't know that I practice Reiki would tell me, when I put my hand on them, for a physical exam, let's say I'm listening to somebody's lungs and my one hand is on the stethoscope, the other hand on the person's back, and the person would just say, oh my God, you have healing hands. So things like that. So I've had quite a few remarkable experiences as a doctor too, related to Reiki, but I think it's practicing Reiki has, I would say, elevated me to a different level as a human, as a doctor, in every way.
I, for one, think there should be more doctors like you, have more tools in their toolkit like you do. Well, and how do other doctors or people in the medical profession have a reaction when they find out that you're a medical doctor and you're also a Reiki master?
I'll be honest with you, in the beginning, I was hiding it because it sounds, for most doctors, it sounds crazy because they're not exposed to it. And again, unfortunately, even though there's research out there, it's really inadequate. Unfortunately, it's quite inadequate. So for most doctors, it's hard to comprehend why would somebody do something like that, a technique that's not proven. Why would somebody use that? But In my case, I've had a decade of observational evidence to see that it works to the point that I chose to learn it. But generally, doctors have a surprised, uncomfortable reaction. At this point, for the last few years, I'm no longer hiding it. So if somebody asks me, I openly admit, yes, I practice Reiki. In fact, I've combined my two LinkedIn profiles, the Reiki and the medical, into one. So that was a big step. Yes, because again, I don't want to, I no longer want to hide my gifts in a way. And again, thanks to Reiki.
Are there reactions? Is there any stigma when they find out that you're a Reiki master that maybe that you're not? I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, do they say, well, what medical school did you go to make sure that you're a real doctor?
I think it's just too uncomfortable for doctors to meet someone who does something outside the box. It's very uncomfortable. And honestly, I can see it would have been my reaction before I had exposure to Reiki, to the point that I realized it's not just a placebo effect. So of course it creates certain doubt. How can a trained medical practitioner utilize something that's by Wikipedia is considered a pseudoscience? And there's a lot of pushback. In fact, I've looked into NIH grants to try to conduct clinical research in Reiki, because I actually do clinical research as part of the different things that I do. And it was very disappointing to see that there were, at the time when I was looking into it, there were no available grants to study Reiki. Not only that, I've seen a lot of forums where physicians were advocating against using NIH funding for something like Reiki, because according to them it was proven not to work. So I feel very saddened that we can be so narrow-minded. And I think especially now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have, for the most part, no idea what we're doing with the virus, and our hands are tied. And still, I would say most doctors would completely dismiss the possibility that Reiki could be helpful in something like this. And which I believe, again, I haven't personally given Reiki to any of the COVID-19 patients, but I'm certain it can be of some benefit. Again, I can't say it for sure. Of course, I have to always give the disclaimer, being a medical doctor, there's nothing 100%, but it certainly can't hurt. And again, that's something that in the middle of this challenging circumstance, it's something amazing to be able to do. I'm really hoping that there will be enough window of time between now and the second wave of the pandemic where I can teach as many people as I can, so they can help each other, help the loved ones, help people at home, help themselves. Again, it's so simple, it's so gentle. Anybody can learn it, and it's just I wish more people had access to it. Unfortunately, not enough people have access, and again, there's a lot of pushback from the medical professionals. But yeah, that's okay. One day, I would say for most doctors, it's only when they experience either a serious or incurable illness themselves, and then they're forced to look into alternative modalities. That's when they become more open-minded. But until then, it's a question of research, and our hands are tied because there's not enough grant money to do research. And if it's privately funded, of course, there's a different bias involved. So yeah, so it's a challenge. It's a challenge to study it, to prove that it works, so that doctors can look at the research, look at the data, and see for themselves that it does work. It's not just an individual experience here and there.
Everything that you said, I mean, you said is just so on the money for me, and what I've learned throughout the process, and research. There's a lot of publicly funded research that's biased too.
Yes, for sure.
So, and I don't know if you can hear this bird, but can you hear the bird outside my window?
Yes, it's beautiful.
What does this thing do? Is this like a mating call or something? Like, what is this bird trying to do right now?
I think it's chiming in. Yes, I agree. More Reiki.
It's feeling the energy, um, which is where I want to go too. It's I really want to talk about how that energy works, because I know firsthand, from like I remember, I think it was the second time I saw you, that and you had moved around to different parts with your hands on my body, and I remember you were at my feet at one point, and the energy just shot up right up my leg into my right lung area, which is where I had some issues and where they had found some cancer, and I think I had just had a biopsy there. um,
Mm.
and so that was such an amazing feeling, like the energy just knew where to go. And so can you talk a little bit about how that works? I'm not sure if anyone knows, but just what your experience is with that.
Yes, again, from the that another disclaimer, not from a medical perspective, but from the Reiki perspective, the energy will go where it needs to go. So it basically facilitates a person's individual self-healing. So the practitioner only is acting as a channel for that key, for that energy from the universe to go in and help the receiver of Reiki to self-heal. So it's natural self-healing. Obviously, the closer you are with your hands to the problem area, the more effective it's going to be. But even if your hands are not exactly on the spot where the problem is, Reiki somehow finds its way. Again, I don't have a medical explanation. This is a Reiki explanation for it.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the journey that I had, and I don't even know if I have the right thoughts to like organize to even talk about it, because it was so interesting and so um, I don't even know how to describe it, mysterious. But you know, almost every single time, if not every single time, I experienced something that actually helped me on my journey to health again. And one of the things I had was a lot of anger
Mm-hmm.
from just being really pissed off about having to deal with this again. It's making me like all upset again. But I was just so, I just couldn't believe it was back. And like, why is this here? And then, and I'd even talked to my therapist too about like, why do I have all this anger? I don't even feel like I have control over it sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a really interesting thing that happened with you and I that I was completely unaware of actually until we spoke about it. And but another healer had talked about ancestral anger, and sometimes it's in our DNA. And I think maybe that had been a part of it, but also at the same time, I had my own anger that I was carrying around that I had to deal with this again. And probably tied to childhood traumas too, and issues I had with my parents, and things that had happened back then. And so in particular with my father. And so there was one experience when we were at the Japanese gardens at Balboa Park, where you teach your classes, and where I was laying down on the table. I think I was face down, right?
I think face up.
Face up, okay. And there was an experience that had occurred. Are you able to describe that, or should I?
Go ahead.
Okay, so as from what I understand, I was laying down, and there was a certain period of time where an older person pretty much sat up out from my body, like kind of came up and went, "Ooh," like this, and then kind of floated away. Correct? Is that correct?
It just dissipated.
This dissipated. Okay, and the image that was described was sounded very much like my father. And I think I sent you a picture on Facebook, a picture from Facebook of my father, and that it looked very similar to what you had seen. And I know this is completely unusual.
Yes.
And go ahead.
Well, I have to say, because I'm a spiritual person, but I'm not. I don't necessarily believe in ghosts or any kind of unusual experiences. Again, coming from medicine, from science, this is even Reiki is an extremely huge leap for me to make. So this was actually quite an unusual experience. And while I was giving you Reiki, I was in a meditative state, which is very common for a Reiki practitioner to be, because we're staying in the same place for a long time. And literally, this is something I saw with my eyes closed. Again, it was not a hallucination, of course. It's not anything else, but it was, I don't even know how to describe it. Basically, that what you described exactly was what I saw. And it was also a knowing that that entity, that person was your father. I knew that it was your dad without ever seeing him. It's just somehow I just knew. And then when you sent me his picture, it was exactly the man, which is, again, it sounds really bizarre. I have no explanation for it. Again, as a Reiki practitioner and definitely as a doctor, it's kind of hard to talk about it because you wouldn't expect normal people to have such experiences. So, and I'm pretty normal, so I don't know what to make of it, to be honest with you. Well, but I know it was very powerful for you, so.
It was, and then it got even kind of more bizarre, but in a wonderful way, where I was working with a healer. I think it was either a couple days or a week later, and I'd been working on trying to release this anger from my body, and she had told me that my father had shown up during this healing practice, and my father had passed away about 9 months before all of this. And I was not very close to him at all. I hadn't spoken to him in years. And he had been showing up quite a few times with this one therapist in Topanga that I had gone to, with this other woman. There was, he was making appearances. And so at this particular time, after this had happened with you, she told me that he had shown up and that he told her to tell me to thank you, my Reiki master, for releasing him. And whether it was, symbolic or, more to it, I'm not sure. But all I know is after that moment that you told me that, I had felt a huge release in my body. It was my shoulders, which were always kind of tense, had just kind of relaxed and came down, and all that anger was gone. And I noticed it specifically because I had gone into a sandwich shop after I got off the phone with you, and I just realized like the joy I felt in standing in line, a long line, and and just being at peace with myself. And then to have that conversation with her afterwards, and where he actually told her, and she knew nothing of this, told her to tell you, thank you for releasing him. Really, it just opened up my eyes to, much bigger things that, I had been sort of aware of, but not so much. And that helped me on my road to healing as well.
And this is also quite remarkable, because this is not a typical experience during Reiki. This is just something that happened. So again, it's not something that is typical for Reiki. Usually, again, the practitioner and the person receiving Reiki maybe just are feeling relaxed, but not necessarily seeing something or experiencing something like this. But what was also interesting, that I actually, because I was in a meditative state during the session, I actually forgot about it for several hours, and then I remembered it later, and I thought, okay, maybe I'll share it. It was just a strange experience of seeing someone who I knew was your father raise up from you. It just was so bizarre that I thought, okay, maybe I'll share it, and maybe it will have some meaning to you. And again, I didn't even think of it, and I thought maybe it would be some kind of meaning relating to something else. I didn't even think much of it, but clearly it was something that really help you let go of that anger. And actually, another thing I just remembered, that during that experience, I also had a knowing that the anger you were feeling was not your anger, it was his anger. And by him being released, his anger is being released from you also. Again, I just want to point out, it's not, I don't have an explanation for how and why it happened during Reiki. This is not a typical Reiki experience, but I'm glad regardless.
Even without Reiki, I don't think it would be a normal experience.
Yes, exactly.
But I tell people now, I made amends with my father after that. Well, since he died, I made amends with my father, and he's come up a couple other times too, in imagery and through someone who channeled information from him, and he actually said something to her about how he wished I knew what he had gone through to make him the way he was, when he was our dad. And so, but once that was released, and once I was able to release in my own personal anger too, it just opened up my relationships with my parents, both on in a really good way. So the healing art of Reiki is pretty amazing, I have to say, and I recommend it to anyone who's open to listening about it. And in true testament, learned it myself too, and I'm so generous to have received so much Reiki, and I'm so happy to be able to give it now too. And let's talk about Reiki a little bit too. There is another form of Reiki called Western Reiki, and you touched on it earlier about how Jikiden Reiki has really been preserved. And if you can talk a little bit about the difference between Jikiden and Western Reiki.
So Reiki originated in Japan, and as far as we know, there are two main lineages that exist. Both of them originated from Usui Sensei's student Hayashi Sensei, who was a naval officer and a medical doctor. And he taught Chiyoko Yamaguchi, who started the Jikiden Reiki Institute, with her son Tadao Yamaguchi, and I've learned from Tadao Yamaguchi. But another person who learned from Hayashi Sensei was Mrs. Takata in Hawaii. And I would say 99% of all the Reiki practitioners have learned from the students of her students. So, but the difference is that Jikiden Reiki was preserved in Japan for this whole entire time. So nothing was changed, added, removed, mistranslated, and so on. Whereas when Reiki came to the West through Hawaii, some things may have been lost in translation and so on. And also originally all the classes, you were not able to take any notes in class. So imagine certain Japanese symbols or different Japanese concepts taught in the Western world, how easy it would be to misinterpret, misremember, especially if you're not able to write it in class. So not surprisingly, over time, Reiki got significantly diluted to the point that you can even find classes online, there's no way to teach Reiki online. You can teach history of Reiki perhaps, but not Reiki itself as a technique. So again, unfortunately, it's becoming more and more diluted. And that's another reason why I'm so passionate in terms of following Jikiden Reiki teachings, because it's directly taught and directly passed on from teacher to student, the way Hayashi Sensei taught Shioku Sensei and so on. So I think it's really, really important, because right now, if Reiki gets diluted more and more, at some point it's not going to work. So not to say that Western Reiki doesn't work and Jikiden Reiki works. That's not the case. But the more we move away from the original techniques, the less likely it's going to work as effectively. So that would be, I would say, the main difference. Actually, there's another difference, because in Western Reiki, it became really popular during New Age movement, and a lot of other modalities were added on to Reiki, new techniques. So some techniques were dropped, other techniques were added. Chakra clearing was something that was added on, other concepts and so on. So that's something that happened in the West as people were trying to make sense of traditional Japanese healing art and trying to put together other healing modalities into one, and maybe try to make it better. I'm not sure. So again, not to say that these other techniques don't work, they're different.
And are there different? Well, for instance, can you talk about distance Reiki, and Heiki Chiryo?
So in Okuden, we learn certain techniques that, Seiheki Chiryo is, it's treatment, again, I'm using it not in a legal term, but treatment for psychological problems or bad habits, certain negative tendencies. And it can be quite effective. It's whether it's if somebody wants to quit smoking or has, let's say, fear of heights, or basically any negative tendency that's holding you back. So Seiheki Chiri can help with that. Usually we don't introduce this technique until a person has received in-person hands-on Reiki for at least several times, because even that alone can be helpful. Mm-hmm. And then as far as distance Reiki, again, sounds very far-fetched. And I remember learning it and thinking, there is no way this is possible. This cannot work. So this was my first impression of it. But then again, as a scientist, I was going to put it to a test and see if I do it, and if the people who live in other countries, some of my friends who live in Italy, if I do it for them, whether or not they feel anything, would they have any improvements. And quite remarkably so, they felt improvements. In fact, one of them, she was writing her thesis to finish her PhD, and she was at a complete block. She only had literally weeks left to finish 6 months worth of work, and she was not able to focus. And so I was able to do a distance Seiheki Chiri, actually distance technique for not being able to concentrate. And remarkably, she was able to, that weekend she was able to do more work in 2 days than she was able to do in the previous 3 to 4 months. And she was able to successfully complete her PhD program, and even actually mentioned me in the thank you of her thesis. So again, obviously there were not just these two people, but I've had enough experience with it to know that as remarkable and as unbelievable as it is, it definitely does work. So again, that's you have to see it and experience it to believe it. Again, I certainly don't advocate for anyone to start suddenly believing in Reiki or distance Reiki or Seiheki Chiri without ever trying and experiencing it for themselves, because that just, again, I can recognize it's a far-fetched concept. So unless somebody experiences it for themselves, I certainly don't advocate to blindly believe something and just say, yes, it works because Dr. Danilychev said so. No, that's not the case. People have to try it and see for themselves. And again, and also distance Reiki, it's something that we don't do just because we don't feel like seeing a person in person. It's something that's done when there's no other way. For example, if someone really close to you needs Reiki and they're not physically present, or you're not able to be physically present with them, then you can do a distance session. Again, ideally, we don't want to give distance Reiki as a first Reiki experience. Of course, there are exceptions to the rules if somebody is suffering, and that's the only thing you can do. And again, in today's challenging time, I think it's an incredible technique to know, because so many people are, unfortunately with COVID-19, they're forced to be isolated to the point, let's say if somebody's hospitalized, their loved ones can't visit, someone is dying, there's no way except for connecting briefly over the phone or over Zoom or FaceTime. So it's really tragic that people can't help their loved ones, can't even be there. So knowing distance Reiki can be something so remarkable during this time. So again, I think it's something definitely just such an incredible technique. Medically, or scientifically, I have absolutely no explanation for it, how it would work. Zero. But one day, just as Usui Sensei, the originator of Reiki, as he said, one day hopefully it'll be explained by science.
I have to say, the first time I heard about distant Reiki, I wasn't sure it was going to work either. And then once I received it, I remember just thinking, oh my God, it actually really works. and then being able to take your class and learning how to do it, I was a little bit, I was a bit tenuous the first time I gave it, because I thought, oh, I don't know if this is going to work, or if I'm going to be good at this or doing this right or whatever. And the woman I was giving it to, I remember her emailing me shortly thereafter saying, I completely felt it. And, and the next morning she woke up, and whatever ailment was that she said it was hardly even there anymore. And I think part of the thing is too, is that the fact that anybody can do it. Are there certain techniques that you learn over time, so that as you give or receive Reiki, um, that certain techniques are honed, or you get better at feeling where the energy is going, or can you describe like what you start to learn as time goes on in practicing?
So basically, as practitioners will learn to feel how the energy flows, or if it doesn't flow well through a person. I can't get into too much detail because that's part of the class, but and that's something that takes practice. And I can tell you that as a doctor, I was extremely skeptical when I first learned about it. I just couldn't believe that I can feel anything like that. That whatever I was feeling, it was just in my head. It was not real. So it took a long time, and for me to be sold on, yes, that it's true indeed, we can sense this. It's remarkable. And again, it took, I would say, at least a few years of regular practice to be convinced, just because medically it was impossible. So my mind was refusing to believe my experience.
It's so interesting, because a couple of the people that I'm interviewing, they're doctors who do alternative things like yourself. And so, the question I've asked all of them and plan to ask everyone is will science catch up to what some people already know? Like, this works. You think science will ever catch up to it?
I think most definitely. I think if there are clinical trials in Reiki, so randomized controlled trials, in terms of Reiki placebo, it's a little bit difficult to create and arrange, but again, it's not impossible. So if we're able to set up reproducible clinical trials, then even though the clinical trials wouldn't explain how it works, but it can prove that it works, that'll be the first step. So once it's proven that it works, then more people will be curious in terms of studying what this energy really is, how it gets channeled, how to make sense of it. Right now, I know there have been studies in terms of trying to see if energy from practitioners' hands is different from energy from other people's hands, but this concept is fundamentally flawed, because we don't know what energy we're studying. So how can you measure something you don't know what you're measuring? So again, a lot of the studies, unfortunately, have been quite flawed from the beginning, because Reiki practitioners are not scientists, and scientists have no idea about Reiki. In fact, most studies don't even mention which style of Reiki is being used. So it's like studying apples and oranges if you're using different practitioners with different Reiki styles. So there are a lot of challenges, honestly. I would say it's going to be a long road, but I'm certain at least the effectiveness of Reiki can be proven through clinical trials. There's no doubt in my mind.
All the different rabbit holes I've gone down in the research of trying to, get healthy again, so many of them come down to like, they all talk about, and forgive me since I'm not medically trained, but just the how in our bodies, and when you get down to the subatomic areas, like, it's just energy interacting with energy, and we're basically all just energy. And so it makes sense to me that we're using energy on energy. Yes. To make things heal, right? But could you say that in a more educated way?
Well, I perhaps I'll say the challenge in the medical field related to that is ultimately Western medicine is based on structure, on anatomy, maybe biochemistry, but ultimately on particle-based physics of our body, and it completely dismisses the spiritual aspect of human beings. So Western medicine is anatomy and physiology, biochemistry, and what can go wrong with those parts of us. But again, the energy aspect is completely dismissed from Western medicine, and just because the physics of medicine is a little bit behind of the actual physics. And then and the spiritual aspect, it's really dismissed. Emotional aspect is delegated to therapists. Biochemical aspect of emotional problems is okay. Psychiatrists deal with it, so medical doctors. But again, we're too. I think Western medicine, unfortunately, is looking at people in a somewhat narrow-minded way, just anatomy, biochemistry, and nothing else. And I really feel that it's limiting. And I can say that also because of my hospice background. Again, I come from a very scientific background, not religious at all, and to see so many people transition, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people transition, makes you see the spiritual aspect of passing, and also has made me look at death as a transition as opposed to this is the end. So I can say that life is very spiritual. Humans are very spiritual beings, and even the transition, again, from my hospice experience, it's a spiritual experience. So we can't eliminate that, and unfortunately, in Western medicine, we completely disregard that aspect. And also the fact that our mind, body, and soul, ultimately, everything is connected. You can't treat one and ignore the other two. You're not going to achieve proper healing if only one is being treated. And usually, in Western medicine, we treat the body. We don't really, might help the mind a little bit, but I would say inadequately so, not too closely connected to what the body is experiencing, vice versa. And again, of course, the spirit is completely removed from the equation.
Mm-hmm. And I've found that your last statement to be pretty typical in dealing with doctors in the Western world. And sometimes not no fault of their own, other than being that they're just doing exactly what they're being trained for. But on that note, I have to say I had so many amazing doctors. Western medicine doctors. I have so many of them, but I always came across other doctors in the periphery or in the peripheral environment of that maybe weren't very open-minded and were let's just say a little too sure of what they thought they knew, especially when it came to my diagnosis. So
and honestly, it's not surprising, because in medicine we learn so much, just the quantity of information and how fast we have to process it. When somebody comes in with some complaint, within minutes the doctor can figure out a few possibilities and then order tests accordingly, and so on and so forth. So the amount of knowledge that we have unfortunately puts us in a position where we think we know it all, and it's unfortunate because obviously we don't. But it's also not surprising, because with decades of education and years of experience of being right, it's really hard to take a step back and say, what if I'm not right? What if what my patient is saying is actually correct? And what I'm thinking, because of my decades of education, decades of experience, maybe it's just a limited experience ultimately, or only narrow experience.
That's a really good point, and I will try to have compassion with the next doctor who tells me I'm going to be on chemotherapy for the rest of my life, and I'm clearly not. that when they say something like that, maybe instead of being angry and walking away or just slightly disagree with them, I will be more compassionate the next time. I think we've covered everything. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to? I probably covered more than you wanted to.
That's okay. I just want to mention, since you said about compassion, Kyoko Yamaguchi, the founder of the Jikiden Reiki Institute and the person who learned from Hayashi Sensei, who learned from Mikao Usui Sensei, she used to say that Reiki is compassion in action, which is it's just something so beautiful. Ultimately, as Reiki practitioners, we're not doing anything, and the energy of the universe is there all the time. But we're compassionately being present for someone who's receiving Reiki and going through their own process of self-healing. So I just want to mention that.
That's a really good note to end on too. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Danilychev. We really appreciate you being here, and maybe we can have you come back again, or maybe do a webinar at some point where people can ask you questions.
Sounds great. Thank
Okay.
you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye.